Hello, Samantha. Welcome to At Home with Austen for a Bit Lit. Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about your exciting Austen game, Regency Love. I wondered if you could start by telling me a little bit about yourself.
Okay, it's lovely to be here today, Emma, and thank you so much for your time. I know that with the 10-hour difference at the moment, I'm really glad we managed to find a time that we can both come here and chat. So my name is Samantha. Essentially, I come from, I suppose, a literary background. I did my bachelor's degree in Australia, and it was an arts science degree. And then I did my master's in the UK and my PhD in the UK as well.
Fantastic.
So that's kind of how I know a lot about Austen and about the Regency period. But also, since I was about maybe 11, 12, I started doing a lot of writing, particularly in fan fiction. I don't know if are you familiar with fan fiction, the concept?
Yes, I wrote some Harry Potter fan fiction as a teenager, so yes, very familiar with that world.
Yeah, so that's how I started writing. I did a lot of fanfic, and then eventually started writing my own characters and my own original stories.
Wonderful. And so I like that actually lens as a way of looking at Regency Love as a game, the idea that it is a form of interactive Austen fan fiction. But I mean, your PhD was in Shakespeare, right? So was Austen an interest kind of simultaneous running alongside that?
Yes. So my master's was actually technically it was called Romantic and Victorian Literary Studies, but I spent all of the time working on the long 18th century. So my dissertation was on Thomas Moore, the Irish poet. So I was looking at a lot of Austen's contemporaries for my master's, and then the PhD just somehow happened, and it was in Shakespeare. So yeah, it all ended up working out.
Fabulous. And so how did the idea for Regency Love come to you? I know it's a collaborative venture. So was it did it come out of a conversation, or was it something you'd wanted to do for a while?
So at the time, I think this was back in 2011, a good friend of mine got me and another friend together, and we decided we wanted to make a game. At the time, we were very much into a game called Dragon Age. I'm not sure if you've heard of that. It's a fantasy RPG. So it's very much the traditional RPG. You have to slay dragons and monsters. There was a lot of fighting involved. But one reason we loved the Dragon Age series was the romance parts that you could play. So as the protagonist, you meet with these characters throughout the plot, and then you can actually start romantic relationships with them. So we decided, what would it be like, to create a story where we take out all of the sword fighting, take out all the sorcery, and take out all the enemies and the gore, the blood and gore, and just turn it into a romance, turn it into a period romance. And as soon as we got that idea going, I think at the time we were also a bit obsessed with some of the adaptations at the time. I can't quite remember. I think Paul Dark was out and around that time. So we were watching a few TV series, and we were very much into Dragon Age, and we thought, let's just meld the two together and see what we get.
Fabulous. And I was saying to you earlier that I'm really happy that you did do that, because as someone who, I don't play games generally at all, I don't have any background in playing games, and I came across Regency Love, and it was like an epiphany for me, because I suppose all Austen fans want to step inside the novels, and this is a game where you sort of can step into a world that's very similar to that of the novels. And I was doing my PhD the first time I played it, and I was meant to be working all day. I had like a chapter due, and in the end, my then boyfriend had to say to me, Emma, are you going to do some work? And I said, but I think Mr. Ashcroft might propose if I just play a little bit longer. So I was really impressed by the way you captured the atmosphere of the Regency world, but also by the kind of narrative propulsion that really did feel like that point in an Austen novel where everything's gone horribly wrong, and the heroine has to get together with the hero, but they don't know how they will. Which I suppose leads me to my next question of, because it's not Austen pastiche. You're not just copying Austen plots. It's an Austen-like world, but in some ways it's very different. So how self-conscious were you about wanting to be sort of similar to Austen, but not just to be Austen characters doing the things we recognize from the novels?
So at the start, we made it really clear that we didn't want to write Austen fanfic, because at the time there were lots of Austen fanfic out there already, lots of Austen adaptations. We wanted to write stories set in the Regency world, and I think a lot of people, they very naturally come to associate the Regency with Austen because of how prolific Austen was during the time. But we didn't want to use any of the current, the pre-existing characters, and we wanted to create our own original stories. Obviously, Austen is she's a huge name. She'd written so many wonderful novels, and there was a point where we were quite struggling with just divorcing ourselves from Austen. We wanted to have particular heroes, we wanted to have particular love interests, but we didn't want to fall down, the whole of, making it Austen fanfic. That's why a lot of our tropes, I think a lot of our players have gone back to us and said, wow, we were really surprised by this. We thought Mr. Graham would have been like Mr. Wickham, and he ended up being really nice, and he didn't break our heart or Lydia's heart. Mr. Ashcroft, a lot of people saw the parallels between Mr. Ashcroft and Miss Ashcroft's relationship, and Mr. Darcy and Georgiana Darcy's relationship. But it was almost a reverse Pride and Prejudice, whereby instead of Darcy having to go save Lydia, by the way, sorry, there are some spoilers here for those any watchers, any viewers who haven't played Regency Love. But in the Ashcroft plot, you need to essentially go and chase after Mr. Ashcroft's younger brother, half brother, Richard, and a lot of our players were very surprised by that, because they didn't think that was a thing. They didn't think that they would get to have so much agency as a female protagonist in the Regency world. So we thought a lot about these plots, about these characters, and how to take the story in ways that a lot of our players may not have expected, but also in a way that felt natural to the characters and to the story, and to the Regency context as well. I mean, I know a few things you had to suspend your disbelief, because I'm sure any gentleman would not have travelled alone up to Yorkshire from Hertfordshire to chase after Mr. Curtis. But I think that's also part of the appeal for a lot of our players, because when you actually go and do that, there are consequences. You don't just run off after Mr. Curtis and come back and expect society to approve and to say, good on you for go chasing the rich gentleman. So we spent a lot of time navigating that as we were writing it.
Yeah, and that's so interesting, because I feel like, that is one of the things that's so gripping about the game, is it's not pretending to be a safe world that, you sort of might think, oh, there are bonnets and love interests and it's definitely going to be a happy ever after. But like you say, there's a sense of the real stakes that women lived by in terms of their reputations in Regency England, and that you can't escape those rules of society. But you're right that, simultaneously, there's that sense that women get slightly more agency and choice than they would necessarily in an Austen novel in terms of rescuing the hero. And it's interesting that you brought up your Mr. Wickham-esque character, because I did admit when I first saw dashing redcoat, I thought, okay, philanderer, scoundrel. So that's quite nice that you sort of subvert and play with the players' expectations there about the kind of characters they're going to get. So I suppose my next question is about the actual mechanics of the game and how all these different plots work, because so I'm extremely ignorant about how gaming works and how you write. I mean, the closest analogue I can think of are choose your own adventure novels, because there must be so many different choices that lead to so many different paths. And I suppose that's one of the things that give your heroines a lot of agency, because the choices you make are what shape the game. So how does that work as a writing process?
So in terms of the writing process, it was very much like coming up with a choose your own adventure in miniature. The main issue I had, so the main challenge I had when I was writing this back in 2011, by the way, you mentioned that you were playing this while doing your PhD. I was writing Regency Love while doing my PhD. And my supervisor at the time did not officially know about my side project, because I think he was afraid that it would, detract from my quality of my PhD work. But yes, at the start, one thing that I found really difficult was how everything had to be short, because this is for a mobile game. This is not the traditional, not traditional print. I have here Lady Lavender, which is this. It's a kind of a sequel spin-off of sorts. I can write lots here, and this is what I'm used to writing. This is what I was used to writing, just your typical prose fiction. But when it came to Regency Love, the conversations, the choices that you could have as the protagonist, I had to make sure that they were Twitter-esque in length. I couldn't make them particularly long. We did have a couple of, not arguments, but I was told off a lot by our game designer, Mel, and she's also the programmer, so she does all her magic with the coding. She told me off a lot at the start because I was just writing these huge chunks of text, and she said, well, this is too much. It's too much for me to read. And I think it was very useful that I was working with Mel, Melody, who doesn't really read much, and then Jenny, our artist, who doesn't read at all. So the two of them became my kind of test subject at the start, because if I couldn't grab their attention in however many words, then I had to go back and rewrite that particular section. So that was one of the main challenges. But we basically sat down and we thought about the different plot points and the different divergences, what we could have done at which points, and then I just had to write all the possibilities. So I think in total, the full game, so including the Graham expansion, would have been about 250,000 words because of all the different choices. Even though if you play through it once, you're not going to get all 250,000 words. If you are to go through every single option, you could get there.
That's really interesting, because that's a hefty novel, and yet the experience is more like, I suppose, a novella or a long short story in each individual game. And it's interesting what you said about initially writing so much, because I suppose if you're using Austen or novels of that period more generally as your model, even the sentences are so long and complex, and that's so much part of the style. So that must have been a really interesting challenge to try and make the dialogue period and yet pithy, and sort of balance those two things. One of the things I liked about it was the fact that in the choices of what you say, there are obviously choices that change the plots, but there are also choices that change your character and sort of affect how nice or how poised or how sort of witty you are at different points. But what I wondered was, to what extent did you sort of have I suppose, a moral universe? Because I'm aware that there were lots of points where I could be unpleasant if I wanted to in character. And I actually found that really hard. I tended to stick to the more pleasant character choices. But there was one point, and I'll try not to use names so that it's not a spoiler for people who end up getting there in the game, but there is one character who is a good friend of another character. And if you fall in love with one character, you then meet the friend who falls in love with you and behaves very unpleasantly because of it. But there is no option for you to run off with this friend or have an affair with him or do anything that would truly be outrageous according to the morals of the time. And I suppose I was thinking about a novel like Mansfield Park, where you do get adultery and really shockingly bad behavior. And I wondered how far did you want to go with the sort of the morals of your universe? Was it just that would have been a whole other plot and it was a plot too many, or were you trying to keep people within the realms of sort of good Regency womanhood to a certain extent?
So I've got a lot to unpack there. Firstly, we wanted for that particular plot and subplot to create the feeling of discovering that someone who hasn't particularly been nice to you has been in love with you the whole time, and that feeling of just impossibility. You can never get together with said person. We just really, we really wanted to convey that emotion. And that was one reason we decided not to allow a choice for it. It would also be very out of character for those two best friends to betray each other. But because that character whom you couldn't get together with became so popular, we did end up writing a spin-off novel just based on that character. Yeah.
That's so interesting. So that's what gave birth to the novel, because so many of us were going, oh,
yes.
Him.
Yeah. In terms of the morality of the Regency world, we didn't actually want to be too restrictive. So we actually ran into a few problems with the game mechanics in that we couldn't have given the characters as much choice as we wanted because of the way the game design worked for Regency Love. Now, in the second Regency Love, or the sequel rather, Regency Love London, which is what we've been working on. We're very slowly working on it. We're actually, so very slowly though, snail's pace. We're going to allow even more choices. We're going to allow a lot more freedom. We've changed the game design mechanics so that a lot more of what you do in your free time. So, for example, all of the accomplishments that you work on in the original Regency Love, they didn't actually affect the plot so much, right? We are going to change that so that if you're reading a particular book, there are things from that book that you can actually use in your real life conversations with other characters, so on and so forth. So we've redesigned those game mechanics, and we're actually going to allow for just a lot more colorful behavior, let's put it that way, because we are moving to London, and London is very different from a small town in Hertfordshire. So there are so many things I want to talk about, but apparently I have to keep quiet.
All right, well, I look forward very much to discovering that when that becomes available. That's so interesting, that the setting, and I suppose almost a different genre of novel in a way that it's sort of inspired by, maybe will give you all those kind of wider possibilities. And so that's interesting that you mentioned the kind of the things you do in your free time, the accomplishments in Regency Love don't actually affect the plot. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about the characterization and how much that affects the plot, because I'm aware that some of the characters, if you make particular choices in your character, you can turn into almost a Caroline Bingley type character, sort of someone who's pointed and unpleasant and sharp. And because I can never bear to play that, I'm interested, does that always lead to different plot outcomes? Or I suppose what I'm asking, are character and plot the same? Or can you be a whole range of different characters while having a similar plot?
So for Regency Love, you can have the same plot or a similar plot, regardless of how you behave. What ends up changing, so there are two parts of the game mechanics that you don't really, so there's one part you see, and that's your personality. So you might see, for example, your witty score is at so and so. You might be a bit rude or forthright or whatnot. So that affects your epilogue. So at the end, how you have all the text. So that affects your epilogue. There's a more invisible scale, which is every time you respond to anyone in the game, there is an approval rating. So you can get, they might approve, you might get approval +1, it might be neutral, it might be -1. And depending on that, the epilogue will have certain text, based on your relationship with those characters. Now, again, we're changing all of that in Regency Love London, so there's even more of an effect in the story, because there were quite a few limitations in Regency Love. We started working on it in 2011, and the Graham expansion pack, I think, was released in 2015, and it's been 5 years since then. So we've learned a lot about game design and about writing, and there's so much more we want to do now. Now that we know what is possible and what what we want to achieve. We don't want to just make it linear with some choices here and there. We really want to open the world in Regency Love London.
How interesting. Oh, well, yeah, I'm very excited about that. I also wondered, so when writing your spin-off novel, which it sounds like really did arise sort of organically out of the game, was that process, I mean, obviously you showed us the length of it, so it's much lengthier than any of the individual plots in the game, but how did that process differ? Did you find that actually, because you'd done the world building, it was just more of being in that world, or was writing a novel very different to game writing?
It was very different, because I got to the point where I didn't know how to write prose. I didn't know how to write descriptions and emotions, and I couldn't do that because for Regency Love, I didn't have any of that interiority. It actually took me several years. I think I started the first draft of what is now Lady Lavender back in 2015, and then it was published last December. So it went through many drafts. I was writing, at the time I was living in the UK, so I'd written parts of it all across the world, really. I was traveling and writing, and then, I'd come back to Sydney and I did some writing, and then I went and traveled a bit more and did more writing. And it was really, quite enough. And it was very difficult as well, because I think at the start it was just a passion project, but then as it got towards the Kickstarter funding phase, speaking of which, this whole novel was made possible by our wonderful Kickstarter supporters. So yeah, our fans just pitched in and they said, yes, we want this to happen. So that was great. But at that time, I felt a lot of expectations from our readers and from our fans and our players, and I didn't want to disappoint anyone. But I still wanted to stay true to the essence of Regency Love, which is, we want to tell stories about just ordinary people, and people who aren't necessarily good or bad, people who are a bit, ambivalent in some ways, people who aren't necessarily caught up in all the drama that you see these days. A lot of the romances, I don't know, do you read many contemporary romances, Emma?
I suppose I don't really know, which maybe it's bad. I read too much period stuff. I get stuck in the past.
Yeah. So a lot of contemporary romance, while some of them are great, they don't seem to have that sense of connection and community in the stories. But I think Regency Love is very much about not just you and Mama and Lord Fat Cat, right? You have the whole community of Darlington and beyond.
Yes.
So that's what we wanted to capture in Lady Lavender. But, it's difficult because a lot of people who read contemporary romance, they expect the really passionate love affair, just bodice ripping scenes, and all that. So that was also a challenge for me.
Yes, and that's so interesting, because I suppose that is a feature of Austen as well, that you get there's the main love story that's very significant, but actually, because I've adapted a couple of Austen's novels for the theatre, I found it almost frustrating that actually if you look for the scenes between the hero and the heroine and you're trying to put them on stage so they can talk to each other, there aren't very many, because they're kind of spread out through this kind of interconnected social world. And so that's really interesting that you've had almost similar tension between allowing that to be foregrounded and the desire for bodice ripping type passionate love affair being just about the central figures. I could keep asking you questions about this all day, but I'm very aware that we're coming to the end of our time. So I'll end with two quick questions. One of them is, just because I'm very aware of my ignorance, is there a question that I haven't asked about how game design works or how writing for games works that I should have asked? Is there something you'd like to say about the experience of Regency Love that hasn't been covered? So I'll start by asking that.
I don't know, honestly. No, I can't think of anything in particular. I can't think of anything in particular. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, with game design and with playing games and game writing, what's important is that the user, the player, enjoys it and that they feel it's an immersive experience. And I think if we've been able to create that, then that's a win for us. So right. The rest of the mechanics, who cares about that? It's can you read it? Can you play this and think, wow, I want to keep playing? And, you know, I don't care if I have a chapter due. I don't care if I have to give a paper in 20 minutes. I want to know what happens to Mr. Curtis. You know, that's an important part.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, wonderful. And I think, yeah, as I've said many times in this video, I think that Regency Love really creates that immersive world in a really joyous way. So I suppose my final question is the question we always ask at the end of a bit lit video, even though it's a slightly horrible one. So do you have any possible answers to the question, what is literature?
Another good question. As I tell my students, literature is something that endures, and literature is not something that can be, you know, for us at the moment, it's very difficult for us to judge whether or not something around us is considered literary. There is a huge difference for me personally between what is considered literature and what I enjoy. So that's the other, you know, that's the other battle that I think is very hard for a lot of people. Some people think, literature has to be painful. Literature has to require essays. Shakespeare, back in his day, you know, his plays were not considered literary, but now they are very much the canon of the English literature and the Western literary canon. So the definition, I think, will shift according to whoever's asking the question. I do believe, though, that a lot of the texts that were originally thought of as, you know, too new, too savvy, too lowbrow, okay, with all the massive quotation marks, too lowbrow, such as graphic novels, games. In the future, I think they will be considered literary as long as they endure, they have some kind of merit, they show something about society, about their contemporary society. I think that is literary. But again, that being said, what you enjoy doesn't have to be literature, vice versa. And I'm a very strong believer of just always doing something that gives you joy, something that you love. If you love reading Austen, then keep reading Austen. If you don't enjoy Austen, probably you need to find yourself someone who can explain to you why Austen is amazing, because maybe you're not reading it nice. But if you enjoy reading contemporary romance or, you know, Harry Potter fan fiction, then by all means go and do that.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you for that answer. I love how you both kind of opened up the importance of and pleasure in literature, regardless of whether it's literary or not. And you've sort of suggested an expansion of the canon to include graphic novels and gaming, which is, yeah, I think such an important and exciting way of reading what literature is doing right now. And I'm sorry, I know I said that was the last question, but when you mentioned Austen, that reminded me there's one other question that I haven't asked you. Do you have a favorite Austen novel? And if so,
gosh.
why?
It's like asking me for my favorite Shakespeare. Oof, that's a really tough one. For the longest time, I would have said Emma. I really enjoy Emma because of just how funny it is and how deluded Emma is. And I think she changes the most out of Austen's protagonists. I also really enjoy Mr. Knightley. But I mean, I love Pride and Prejudice. Persuasion is also good. See, I can give you reasons as to why I like each.
Yes.
Maybe top three, Pride and Prejudice, Emma, Persuasion, and top 3.5 would be Sense and Sensibility with Alan Rickman. As you can see, I have quite a thing for Mr.
Yes, I love that adaptation. I was actually just quoting it the other day with a friend, that bit where he says the air is full of spices in the Emma Thompson adaptation. It's just brilliant. Yes, okay, I won't get into a whole Alan Rickman, Colonel Brandon chat now, but thank you for that. And I think that's really interesting, that what you said about Emma changing being a big part of the appeal of that, because I suppose that speaks to your interest in the agency that you get in a game as well, and the fact that, you know, you can make choices and sort of change as a character. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining me on A Bit Lit today, Samantha.
Thank you, Emma. It's been a pleasure.
And I will look out for Regency Love in London. I can't wait.